This is subtext radio. Subtext radio. Subtext. Is this better?
That's perfect.
I'm Anna Kostreva, and this is Recast by Design, a show on subtext radio that investigates spatial practice through interviews and discussions about solidarity, politics, and sustainability in cities. Recast by Design. This show is a response to the anti-racism protests and events going on in the USA and around the world. It investigates the responsibility of spatial practice to racial justice at the societal level, the personal level, and the professional level. It features audio clips from Mabel O. Wilson, Bryan C. Lee Jr., and Angela Davis. The first few audio clips come from the architectural historian Mabel O. Wilson, interviewed by The Design and Motive in 2019 and The Midnight Charrette very recently in 2020. Mabel O. Wilson has written widely on the politics of race, labor, and architecture. In these clips, she speaks directly to whiteness and what it means to think critically about privilege for architecture projects.
When I say white Americans, actually what I really am referring to is whiteness and not necessarily white Americans, because I think whiteness is a position of privilege, that someone with dark skin could actually occupy a position of whiteness. For example, O.J. Simpson in the American context, right, identified with whiteness in ways that allowed him access and privilege. And he was actually quite disparaging to black people or blackness more broadly. And so I often think it's kind of a subject position of power. Just like men can be feminists, right? So it's not a question of being a woman, it's a question of being a feminist, which is about a position in relationship to power or patriarchy. So oftentimes maybe the terms of whiteness or blackness or other, sort of says that there are kind of ideas, opportunities, institutions, practices, ideology. I mean, like all of that then starts to inform what whiteness is. So I think it's becoming aware of what whiteness actually represents, what it allows, what it privileges, is one way, I think, in which, let's say if you're an architect and you are white and you are working with a community that might be a minority community, that you can start to understand those relationships and where they come from and how privilege is operative in that, who has access to certain things and who doesn't. But I think the first thing is to just recognize what that is. I mean, to say that, okay, so I've had opportunities and privilege that are easily facilitated simply by the society I live in and my ability to claim that, right, as a subject position, as an identity. But, I mean, it's also, again, conscious, like as you say, if there's a white architect coming to, let's say, a rural area in Kenya, the first thing maybe should be asked is, okay, if this area is in crisis and in need of, say, a school or something, like, well, why would that area be in crisis? What are the histories of colonization that produces these circumstances? There are all kinds of questions that could be asked, and not just that it's a crisis, but, there are, like, how did that crisis come into being? What are the larger forces that are producing that condition? I think people often look at, for example, cities and think, like informal trading, for example, around the world. People think, that's very chaotic, it's very disorganized, it's just happenstance, people are doing it because they're desperate. No, people actually do it because it's a business, it's profitable, it can be quite organized, in fact. So it actually depends on formal markets. It's just means that oftentimes banks don't regulate it and control it and aren't getting the monies into their system. It means oftentimes that cities aren't necessarily getting taxes, so they're not controlling it at that level. And so the question of formality and informality, or things that look like they might be because you're not familiar with them means that you may not just have a deep enough understanding of it. And so thinking about the prejudices that you might have in reading something, like how do you drop those and actually just sort of open up and see what's happening in a particular location.
It is useful to think about how disciplines like planning and architecture come about, and that they always, they do a lot ally and parallel the rise of an understanding of both racial difference, which meant that there were races that were better, presumed to be better, more superior than other races, and that's an advantage. It means you can take resources. It means you have power, political power, economic power, and it often degrades and dehumanizes the lives of those who are considered to be racially inferior. And that definitely plays itself out in the built environment, precisely because it's connected with legacies of colonialism, indigenous dispossession, the slave trade, and all sorts of encounters that connect with the political, the economic, and the cultural. I mean, I am a child. I was very, very young, but I will say I'm a child of the 60s. So over the arc of my life, I really thought we were going to have a radically different world, a peaceful one. Women would have rights, racism would end, queer rights, LGBTQ. I mean, like, I really just thought we were all on board for a more equitable society, and the same reinscriptions of power relations had just took hold, and had, other formations of domination. So it is disheartening that this is where we ended up. But I think what I believe is perhaps radically different. I think people have had enough. I think, in the last 50 years, we had integration, we had affirmative action, we had multiculturalism, inclusion, and diversity, and that did not solve a thing. Poverty's back to where it was. Cities are segregated, schools are segregated. There's something profoundly not right, both with the nation and the ways in which the modern world functions, including capitalism. So Akira's right, do not trust the corporation. But what I think is different, that I think that people of color are tired of speaking about our oppression to make it visible. And we're asking our white colleagues, family, friends, however, to own what white supremacy and whiteness allows for. Because until that's accounted for, that's the real accounting. Nothing's fundamentally going to change. Because the systems of oppression seem to reconfigure themselves every 50 years.
Through one of the interviews with Mabel O. Wilson, I also learned about the work of Bryan C. Lee Jr., an architect practicing in New Orleans. His firm, Colloquate, has a strong methodology to think about spatial justice, also asking other practitioners to think more broadly along a gradient of systems, including pedagogy, policy, procedure, practice, projects, and people. These audio clips come from talks Bryan C. Lee Jr. gave for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Design Plus Diversity.
So design justice, what does it do? It seeks to eliminate the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a means to perpetuate injustice into the world, right? In design, it allows us to then stratify the profession in a way that brings in people who have historically been disinherited from a process that creates our cities, right? The marginalized have always been the mass. And so finding ways in which design speaks to the masses is where we start to find those little wins. And those little wins start to pile up if only we're on the same page. There's a quote by Whitney M. Young. Whitney M. Young, 1968, spoke to this particular issue, talking about my profession in architecture. You are a profession that is most distinguished by your thunderous silence and complete irrelevance. Yeah, I know, right? I say this in a lot of architecture rooms, and they've heard it a lot, but that was nice. That's the reaction I wanted. It is. It's a powerful statement when a profession of 100,000 speaks so softly or doesn't speak at all on issues of injustice or inequity in the work that we do, and specifically when we have such a powerful impact on the world that we're serving. There's another set of quotes that I talk about, one that is directly by James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room, that says, "Perhaps home is not simply a place, but an irrevocable condition." And I say this because this is the Baldwin test. This is how we kind of understand whether or not we are working with our clients in the right way, and whether or not this is a project that we want to work on. Are we thinking about conditions that are actively seeking equity and justice in the work? It's not simply about the shell. It's not simply about the physicality of the space. It is actually about the forces that create that space and perpetuate that space into the future. The second question that we always ask when we're dealing with clients, when we're dealing with communities, and in community conversations, we can disagree and still work together unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression, the denial of my humanity, or my right to exist. Right? Yeah, you can clap. It's cool. Yeah, I dig that. Yeah, I'm going to take that. It's super important because, again, when we're dealing with spaces that have embedded histories to them, if the conversation does not speak to the ways in which we lift oppressions, lift people's humanity, and lift people's right to exist, then we're having the wrong conversations. And it's not a conversation personally my company will be a part of, but we hope that within the larger conversation of design justice, we ask that other people consider these as principles as well. So how does this affect us, right? So how do we look at the system? When we do this, we can talk about individual biases and we can talk about systemic biases, right? Oftentimes, when we talk about prejudice in the built environment, we often think about these interpersonal connections, interpersonal disadvantages. And that's important. It's important to understand the ways in which bias plays out individually. But the ways in which systems work, extend beyond the individual and extend into the community in ways that last in perpetuity in a lot of ways, right? The city is often seeking immortality, and the ways in which the city, the neighborhood seeks immortality is through the system itself. It's through the pedagogy, the policy, the procedures, the practice that we put in place, the projects, and the people, right? All of these things create a system that we have to interact with in order to make a better space for more people. So we ask that you understand these and you start to see the ways in which these principles can start to impact your work. Because again, as designers, as a designer, my focus tends to be in the practice and project area. And if I'm not careful, I will stay there. And so what we ask is oftentimes for people to think about the ways in which your primary focus goes up and down this continuum, and the ways in which you can play a broader impact on that. So within the design profession, we also have health, safety, and welfare. A lot of times, people don't necessarily understand what the welfare component is. And I find this to be a really, really powerful moment for us to think about the ways in which we already have systems that can be pushed forward even further. The welfare component of HSW speaks to the demonstrably positive emotional and physical response amongst buildings and users, right? Positive emotional response. There's a directionality to it, right? There's a force, right? Mass times acceleration equals a force, right? There is a direction and a mass to that, and that's what we're asking people to consider.
The language that we speak is important. Architecture is a language, and like all languages, it tells a story. Stories are important. Our buildings tell our stories, and diverse stories come from diverse cultures. Culture itself is important, and the culture is a consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate conditions. And our cities, our neighborhoods, and our blocks incubate this culture. And for people of color in America, there is a power in the places and spaces where our culture is recognized, where our stories are told, and where our language is valued. That is not only good design, but it's justice.
The last set of clips come from the legendary political activist Angela Davis. Since the 1970s, she continues to be a provocative and influential speaker with a Marxist, feminist, and abolitionist stance. The first clip is from a recent interview with Democracy Now!, where Davis makes links between racism and capitalism. The second clip is from a talk Davis gave in 2003 at Florida International University about slavery and the prison industrial complex.
Racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place. As Cedric Robinson pointed out in his book, Black Marxism, capitalism is racial capitalism. And of course, to just say for a moment that Marx pointed out that what he called primitive accumulation, capital doesn't just appear from nowhere. The original capital was provided by the labor of slaves. The Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital, was enabled by slave labor in the U.S. So I'm convinced that the ultimate eradication of racism is going to require us to move toward a more socialist organization of our economies, of our other institutions. I think we have a long way to go before we can begin to talk about an economic system that is not based on exploitation and on the super exploitation of Black people, Latinx people, and other racialized populations. But I do think that we now have the conceptual means to engage in discussions, popular discussions about capitalism. Occupy gave us new language. The notion of the prison industrial complex requires us to understand the globalization of capitalism. Anti-capitalist consciousness helps us to understand the predicament of immigrants who are barred from the U.S. by the wall that has been created by the current occupant. These conditions have been created by global capitalism. And I think this is a period during which we need to begin that process of popular education, which will allow people to understand interconnections of racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism.
Okay, well, let me say a few words about prison abolition. Let me conclude with that, and with a story. Because I know that the question that most of you have is, well, what are you going to replace it with, right? If you abolish the prison, what are you going to replace it with? I want to ask you to think about the same question in relation to slavery. If you abolish slavery, what are you going to replace it with? Exactly. I'm asking you to try to think about the abolition of the institution of the prison in a different way, and not to force your imagination to try to come up with a solution that fits the footprint of the prison. Do you understand what I'm saying? It makes no sense to think about another institution that is simply going to replace the prison. No sense. As a matter of fact, the term prison industrial complex allows us to think about the project of abolition in much broader terms. The prison industrial complex is not the sum of all the jails and prisons in this country and throughout the world. It is a set of symbiotic relationships among correctional communities, transnational corporations, media conglomerates, guards unions, legislative and court agendas. Of the increasing transnational incarnations of the prison industrial complex, the most dramatic is the insinuation of U.S.-style anti-crime rhetoric into the new democracy of South Africa, and the erection of a U.S.-style super maximum security prison. as well as the spread of private prisons in South Africa, private prisons owned and operated by corporations that are headquartered in the United States of America. And of course, the largest private prison company, the largest transnational private prison country is Corrections Corporation of America, which got started in Nashville, Tennessee. And until recently, CCA owned and operated the largest women's prison in the country of Australia. Now, if we accept the fact that the contemporary meaning of punishment is fashioned through these various relationships, then our abolitionist strategies will propose alternatives that try to pull these relationships apart. Does that make sense? What would it mean then to imagine a system in which punishment is not allowed to become the source of corporate profit? How can we imagine a society in which race and class are not primary determinants of punishment? Or one in which punishment itself is no longer the central concern in the making of justice? Rather than try to imagine a single alternative to the existing system of incarceration, we might envision an array of alternatives. Education can be seen as the most compelling alternative to imprisonment. And so what we would have to do is demilitarize our schools. Demilitarize our schools. Revitalize education at all levels. Unless the current structures of violence are eliminated from schools in impoverished communities of color, including the presence of armed guards, armed security guards and police. And unless schools become places that encourage the joy of learning, these schools will remain the major conduits to youth prisons and then to adult prisons. Alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination will not lead to decarceration and will not advance the goal of abolition.
Thanks for listening. If you're like me, these past weeks have been full of reflection about how to make positive change. Please go to the Recast by Design Episode 7 page to find the links for the talks and further resources about anti-racism and spatial practice. This episode's background sounds are from Renegade on the Beat, Beats by Khalil, Mocha Beats, and Mehdi.
Hey, this is Alex Head, founder of Subtext Radio.
This is Subtext.
Please go ahead and click the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps us to reach new audiences and promote the artists that we work with. Hit like and hit subscribe.